All right, are we ready to go? Okay, Noah Jansen and Vijnakas, Bojo, Waganakasing, Odawa, and Donjinokitagi, Akinagdawan, and Jon Jinokitagi, Kawin, Anishinaabeg, and Don Nadoda Bendagwazisi. Hello, my name is Noah Jansen. I work for the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians in Harbor Springs, Michigan. I'm in the Natural Resource Department, and I'm not a tribal member myself, but I've had the privilege of working with the tribe for the past 7 years in the area of forestry and invasive species. I'm going to try to go ahead and share my screen if I can. I think you need to enable me to do that, Leah.
You should be able to now.
All right. Okay, so can you see my presentation? Okay. So today, of course, we're talking about helping a forest adapt to ash loss and also climate change in our case. Just a little bit of background about the tribe I work for. The Odawa people originally lived further east, but have lived in the Great Lakes region for hundreds of years. In 1836, they were compelled to sign the Treaty of Washington, which ceded 14 million acres of what is now Michigan to the United States. As part of that treaty, they did retain what is known as treaty rights. So on any lands that are public or on private lands with owner's permission, the tribe can hunt and fish and gather. So that's an important thing, is the tribe doesn't have much of a reservation as such. In 1994, the tribe's sovereignty was reaffirmed by the US government, and today the tribal government is based in Harbor Springs, Michigan, which, if you can see my cursor, is right around here in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula. Okay, so the problem, of course, we're talking about is invasive species like emerald ash borer are functionally eliminating lots of our culturally significant tree species. Black ash in particular was used to make baskets such as the one you see in the top right picture here. That is kind of pretty much going away in our community, is the black ash basket making as a result of the emerald ash borer. And of course, climate change and new invaders have the potential to eliminate even more species from our forests. In response to that, since 2017, the tribe has planted native trees and shrubs to replace ash. We also try to use species or genetic stock from warmer climates to help mitigate climate change. And the area where most of this planting has gone on is the area here in the yellow rectangle on the northern part of the Lower Peninsula here, which is the tribe's Ziba-Midjwang farm. Our objectives are to mitigate the impacts of invasive pests and diseases, of course. We want to reduce climate change related impacts, promote the culturally significant species of trees, improve habitat for wildlife, and protect our soil and water. So at this property, there's 311 acres. Some of it's fields, some of it's forested. And in this particular presentation, I'll be talking about some of the forested areas that we did some underplanting in. We have 4.5 acres total of canopy gaps that we've planted. The gaps range in size from about 1/4 acre to 1 acre, and they're very irregular in shape. They were mostly created by a timber sale that took place shortly before the tribe acquired the property. So we're kind of using existing openings in the canopy to do this planting. The soils are wet and poorly drained on a flat lake plain landform. there's a lot of pit and mound microtopography as well. So we've got areas in the spring when we're planting particularly that are flooded, and then areas that are the mounds that are kind of elevated above the water table a little bit. The openings were not completely cleared prior to planting. I did remove a few additional trees in some of the gaps to open up the canopy a little bit more and let in a little bit more light, but we didn't want to clear everything away because some of those trees are, already well adapted to the site and well adapted to the future climate. I'm thinking of species like basswood, red maple, for instance. And we didn't want to raise the water table or risk raising the water table too much either. The overstory is really a mix of upland and lowland species, featuring red maple, black and green ash, beech, eastern hemlock, basswood, sugar maple, and yellow birch primarily. So one of the things that I want to talk about is how we chose the species that we ended up planting. Some of the questions that we asked, one of the questions we asked was, what are the emerging pests and pathogens that are both affecting our forest now and have the potential to impact it in the future? So here you can see a bunch of pictures of those various pests. We have Dutch elm disease for a long time, emerald ash borer since the early 2000s in Michigan. Beech bark disease is sweeping through our forests and causing a lot of problems right now. Oak wilt and hemlock woolly adelgid are kind of just getting a foothold in Michigan, and a couple other ones that haven't made it to Michigan yet, but are potentially on the horizon.
No, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. There seems to be a little box that says move this window away, and I'm not sure what it is.
Okay, let me see if I can figure out what that is. It's going away, but it comes back whenever I hit the arrow button. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not sure what to do about that.
Okay, well, it's not really impairing your slides. I didn't want to, that was easily fixed. Okay, we can continue on.
All right, thank you. So we also wanted to look at climate change and sort of run the species we were thinking about planting through that filter as well. And this Michigan Forest Ecosystem Vulnerability Assessment from the Forest Service was a pretty invaluable tool. And looking that, it sort of talks about which species are expected to do well and which are expected to do poorly in the future climate in northern Michigan, and which species that are currently further south are potentially going to move north. There's a lot of good information in there about the predicted future climate as well under different climate change scenarios. And I think that they have more of these publications that cover other parts of the country as well. Let's go here. Okay. Another thing I looked at was species range maps. You can find these on like the USDA plants database or Silvix of North American Trees, a US Forest Service publication. It's a little bit older. And another one that I haven't used as much, but is very useful, is the Forest Service Tree Atlas. And this shows not only the current range of different tree species, but also their projected future range or projected future habitat suitability under different climate change scenarios. So that's a very useful one as well. I also thought about, given the type of soils and landform we have, what kind of natural communities would we find on similar soils and landforms in southern Michigan, and looked at what are the dominant species there, and what might we find if the climate was as warm as it is in southern Michigan in the future. And some of these guidebooks were really helpful with that. We also had a tool from the Natural Resource Conservation Service, their tree and shrub selection tool. And I was able to, you can use this to basically select trees by your soil type. And then you can also, I was able to exclude species that are only found in the northern regions of the state and also look at the shade tolerance. There's a shade tolerance column here, and that's important when you're planting in gaps, particularly in smaller gaps. You want to have some tolerant or mid-tolerant tree species selected. Okay, so that said, I put in I created this kind of spreadsheet, and it has a lot of that information compiled into it. Also information about wildlife values, other values such as if there's cultural values for the tribe. And these are the 11 species that we have selected for the ash replacement here. And they include red maple, silver maple, sugar maple, yellow birch, musclewood, American sycamore, cottonwood, swamp white oak, bur oak, American elm, and nannyberry, 2 shrubs there. And some of these are currently found in our area, like red maple and yellow birch, for example. And then some of them are further south and not found in our area right now, such as the musclewood or cottonwood, bur oak. That's another one that's not really found this far north, swamp white oak. So as I said, we planted 4.5 acres total with 840 seedlings between 2017 and 2020. There wasn't any kind of soil disturbance for the site prep. We just removed brush and removed some of the canopy trees in the gaps. The seedlings were all hand planted, bare root seedlings. And the density varied a little bit. We started out with 450 seedlings per acre in 2017, but we reduced that to 115 seedlings per acre in the later plantings. And the reason we did that was because, like I said, this is a wet site with lots of pit and mound microtopography. And when you're planting in the spring, like we did, a lot of the area is basically in puddles. So you don't want to put a new tree seedling, in the water. So you're kind of limited to the tip up mound. So there wasn't really space to put in 450 seedlings per acre, given those constraints. We use tree tubes and weed mats to protect the seedlings as they're getting established. And annual brush cutting around the trees began in 2019. So I have some survival data here. The overall survival was moderate, I would say. We have about 60 to 70% survival over the first couple of years. I measured survival after the first growing season, the second growing season, and the third growing season. Then my plan is also to continue that the 5th growing season and 10th growing season, but I haven't got those data yet. There's a lot of variability in terms of the survival of individual species. So for example, cottonwood and elderberry and nannyberry, both planting years that we did those, they had really low survival. I'm not sure why that is, but some species I found are just easier to plant than others. I'm kind of surprised by the cottonwood. It seemed like it would be pretty easy to grow, but not in our experience with this project. A lot of the other species did fairly well, so I was pretty pleased about that. We don't have any height growth data at this time, but I can tell you anecdotally from the 2017 planting, some of the trees are really small yet, and some of the other trees are 5, 6, 7 feet tall, especially some of the bur and swamp white oaks have really grown well. Few lessons learned. It really helps to shop around for seedling sources. We get all our seedlings from nurseries, and I call around to probably 6 or 7 nurseries every year to find out what their seed sources are for their stock. And I usually end up ordering from probably about 4, sometimes 5 different nurseries to get the species and the seed stock that I want. So we're looking for seed stock that is, from southern Michigan ideally, or somewhere that has a similar climate zone to that. And it's also very useful to dig a soil test before selecting the species. I look at the USDA soil maps, but you really need to get your hands on the soil and feel what its texture is like. Find out if there's like a confining layer that's holding the water on close to the surface, that kind of thing. Some species just have inherently high mortality, like the cottonwood and elderberry and nannyberry from this work. And there's a couple ways that you could try to get around that by using containerized seedlings or plugs, for example. You might try planting seeds instead of seedlings, or do some supplemental watering if needed. I find the weed mats and tree tubes are very helpful, but they do have some downsides. One is that they have to be removed. I've been able to use some biodegradable weed mats. Those have been very nice. Some of them last longer than others, but you don't have to remove them later. They'll just decompose in place. Tree tubes are very useful to protect your tree from deer, but you have to maintain them. You can't just pound in the stake and leave it there. They blow down. The trees get caught in them sometimes, depending on what type you have. So you really have to keep an eye on them and maintain them. And then finally, I would be remiss. I'm not directly involved in some of these other forms of adaptation as much, but biocontrol is something that we're getting into a little bit. We don't have a lot of good information on it yet. I suspect that it may preserve ash, black ash in particular, as a component of the forest, but maybe not of the high quality that you need to preserve the basketry that some of the tribal members engage in. And of course, there's also cultural adaptation. So one of our basket makers has moved to working with a lot of different fibers, such as basswood, bulrushes, cedar bark, to continue making artwork that is culturally significant for the tribe. And I just want to say Chig Miigwech, many thanks to the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, Michigan Intertribal Council, Bureau of Indian Affairs, NRCS, and the many volunteers who helped me plant trees. So that's all I got. Thanks.
Thank you, Noah. Okay. Tony, you're up next.
All right, let's see if I can share my screen here. Okay, everybody seeing that okay?
Yep.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. I'm Tony D'Amato. I'm the director of the forestry program here at the University of Vermont, which sits in the ancestral lands of the Western Abenaki. And I feel very fortunate over the past decade to have worked with many tribes throughout the range of black ash, and humbled to be able to share in this really challenging circumstance here as we try to sustain such a culturally and ecologically important forest type. And so what I'll be doing today is really talking a bit about, and building nicely off of what Noah was describing, some of the work that we've been continuing to pursue. Even though I sit in Vermont, I've worked a lot and continue to work a lot in Minnesota, as well as in Wisconsin and parts of Michigan, to try to understand, can we do some of the strategies that Noah was describing to plant other species, both in response to emerald ash borer, but also I'm thinking more broadly about climate change impacts and how that might play out on the landscape. And so many on the webinar this morning that certainly know well are very familiar with the situation in the Lake States region, but just kind of to broadly put this in context, some of the real concerns, particularly in the areas we've worked, primarily on the ancestral lands of the Dakota and Ojibwe in north central Minnesota, really have been centered on the highest concentration of black ash in North America. And so trying to understand when we have a species that's so both culturally and ecologically significant, and highly concentrated in a single area, and then threatened by an introduced insect, what that might mean, both in terms of cultural lifeways and traditions, as well as in terms of the ecological conditions out in the forest. So most are familiar with kind of the general concerns, and certainly NOAA spoke to these as well, but the notion of emerald ash borer kind of killing canopy ash trees and either changing the hydrology in the system, or if not changing the hydrology, releasing oftentimes reed canary grass or other competitors in the understory, and creating a really challenging scenario for maintaining tree cover on these sites. And so certainly concern about the impact of emerald ash borer itself in these forests. But also in some areas, there have been kind of preemptive harvesting, certainly less so on tribal lands, but certainly in other lands in this region where folks have gone in and cut the ash in advance of emerald ash borer, and certainly generating impacts that might also be undesirable in terms of the ecological outcomes, as well as potential opportunities in the future for sustaining ash and other tree species on this portion of the landscape. And so a key part of what we're doing, and certainly building off of what Noah was describing, is that in the context particularly of emerald ash borer and the potential loss of canopy ash trees, can we still sustain these areas as forested wetlands, even with this stressor out there? So the key area of focus for us, and again, Noah and I didn't coordinate, but certainly it's consistent with what he's been describing, for their lands as well, is that can we use planting as an adaptation strategy that both increases the representation of species that aren't a host to emerald ash borer, so getting non-ash out in these sites, as well as thinking through a climate adaptation lens. Really some of the work that NIAX has really advanced in the region and elsewhere. We're not just thinking about adapting to insects and diseases or invasive plants, but also kind of this broader threat that will interact with it with changing climate. And so what I'm going to do is just dig in to one area, and for Christian and some other folks that have heard us talk about this work before, it's a good opportunity for them to turn off their camera and take a nap. But we'll be kind of highlighting some of the work we've been focusing in on primarily in northern Minnesota, but I will provide just a couple of summaries of what has been happening elsewhere. But I think Noah, as well as Christian's work, will certainly provide more data and has provided more data from other spots folks are working in. But before seeing Noah's presentation, I have two species that I need to add to this list, although the more understory species. But we've kind of been working for a while since the arrival of emerald ash borer in St. Paul in 2009, and that really motivated a sense of urgency among many individuals that intersect with black ash forest to start finding different ways to kind of increase the resilience of these areas. And so this is a summary to the best of our knowledge. Again, my knowledge was incomplete in terms of some of the species that Noah's trying, although we certainly got all the same overstory tree species. But these are kind of what's been tested so far as part of trials throughout the Lake States region, both to Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And so looking through this list of species, those of you familiar with these lowland forests, many aren't surprises. Either there are species that are commonly found in low abundance in these ecosystems, or to Noah's example, and as well as what I'll show, species that are maybe to the south of the region, but nevertheless grow in wet environments, and so may make sense to plant. There is probably one outlier in this list that often raises eyebrows: Manchurian ash. Les is on the call. His brother Mike isn't, but he can relay to him. I once again brought his name up. That this Manchurian ash planting was part of some work in collaboration with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where Mike Benedict was able to actually pound some splints with a lot of effort, I understand, but was still able to pound some splints out of Manchurian ash. And so we included that as part of an experiment with the hope that this could be future splint material if in fact black ash was removed from the landscape. But the majority of these species are at least native to North America, with the exception of Manchurian ash. So as I mentioned, what I'll dig into is just similar to what Noah did, just some experience with a slice of the landscape in a certain suite of conditions. Some of the work that we've been tracking in terms of trying to establish different tree species within black ash dominated wetlands. And I'll focus on that component, but we've also been examining a lot of other aspects of these ecosystems. Sadly, outside of our tribal partners, many from a Western science perspective haven't spent a lot of time in black ash swamps, just given historically they're not commercially valuable for traditional forest products. And so we've been spending a lot of time also just trying to understand the ecology of these forests, both what species of bird and mammal use them, as well as how might things like amphibian breeding habitat be impacted if emerald ash borer comes in. And so I won't talk about that much, but if there's questions about those components, I can certainly speak to those. And so what we did, similar to Noah's work, really looked at a couple of different environments for planting black ash. including underplanting and unharvested areas, planting into areas where folks had preemptively clear cut all of the ash, using more of a gap-based approach, again, consistent with what Noah was describing, and then kind of a fourth treatment where we actually emulated emerald ash borer infestation by kind of girdling and killing the trees, and then planting across these sites. And so we've been tracking this now for 9 years post harvest. So just to give folks a context for the planting conditions that we were working in, again, unharvested controls. So these being kind of your underplanting scenarios, 4-acre clear cuts. So again, you can see the ash resprouting, but certainly a bit different than unimpacted areas. Canopy gaps similar to what Noah is describing. So 10th-acre openings, and then again, areas where all the ash within a 4-acre area were girdled and then kind of slowly declined, similar to what EAB might do in these areas. So the species that we tried out, very similar lens to what Noah was using in terms of thinking about selection. So of course, the first piece of selection is it not an ash, because we want to try to increase diversity on the site. But the other way to look at these is through the perspective of what their climate adaptation is for future climate, based on those tools that Noah mentioned, including the vulnerability assessments that NIAX produces and the climate change tree atlas. And so the species that have an asterisk next to them and are in green are expected to be both obviously adapted to EAB as well as future climate adapted. And so many of those species are currently present in the forest, things like red maple, yellow birch, American elm. But we also included 2 species, hackberry and swamp white oak, that are not currently found in high abundance in the area we're working in. So this is our study area, again, within the ancestral lands of the Ojibwe and Dakota people. And you can see that there's a couple of satellite lips up here of both swamp white oak and hackberry, but generally the range of that species is a bit south of our region. And so we view this as an assisted range expansion of those species. And then, as I mentioned before, Manchurian ash was also included in this work. So in terms of just overall survival, I'm so glad somebody else showed results from planting in ash swamps before me, so I don't look as bad with my survival numbers. But these are challenging environments. As Noah mentioned, there's often limited microsites, a lot of competition, a lot of deer pressure in these areas, and so overall survival, was not what you would expect with upland plantings. But the species that have continued to do well, and actually this picture here is of a swamp white oak, 8-year-old swamp white oak. So they're finally really starting to put on growth on some of these sites. Both American elm, and these are similar to what Noah worked with, a cross between kind of a local seed source and Valley Forge variety of American elm, so disease tolerant individuals. Those two have had the highest rates of survival. Manchurian ash has survived, but it continues to die back due to cold and frost injury. So it's not very cold hardy. So it's kind of just a sprouting little shrub and not really growing much in height. And then hackberry being kind of the next highest survivor, just kind of looking overall across the species. If we dig a bit deeper and look at the planting environment, really the highest rates of survival were in those group openings, as Noah mentioned, thinking a bit about the species shade tolerance, as well as just the ecological dynamics of these ash forests. They're not forests that are characterized by big stand replacing events. It's much more gap scale disturbance in these forests. And so the recruitment niche for a lot of species, including ash, tends to be in these smaller openings. And so really we saw the highest survival in the group openings. And the biggest kind of takeaway from this is that, in those clear cuts, again, Noah described it quite nicely, when you have these, it's basically standing water, and it's exacerbated once you cut the trees because there's no longer transpiration from those mature trees. It's really a harsh planting environment, and most trees did not do well in those clear cut openings, both due to the water table as well as there's a lot of competition being released by that. And so in our case, there's a lot of lake sedge, you can see that pictured here on the right. So in terms of planting, and I think it's worth emphasizing underplanting, because the landscape that we've been doing this work in, these are large areas dominated by lots of ash, 10 to 100, sometimes over 100-acre ash swamps. And so there is the potential for commercial harvests, and certainly there's markets to some degree for some of that material. But oftentimes we're dealing more with this intact ash forest that we want to increase the resilience in. And so, thinking a bit about uncut forests and what that might mean in terms of, looking at, ways to kind of underplant species ahead of time. And so what you're seeing here is in the group selection openings, so the gaps similar to what Noah was talking about, as well as beneath the intact canopy, And you'll notice, even though our survival rates are pretty low overall for the experiment, several species, elm and swamp white oak, have close to 80% survival in those environments. They're doing quite well in those settings. Likewise, hackberry, although it wasn't doing great overall, when planted underneath the intact canopy, actually surviving, over 8 years, over 60% survival. And so we're seeing, some of these species showing promise, and including red maple as species that could be underplanted on these sites. As Noah really nicely pointed out, shade tolerance matters a lot. And so even though you'll see balsam poplar and tamarack around these areas, they're both very intolerant tree species. And so even though they survive really poorly in these scenarios, in some cases, we've actually seen pretty high survival, particularly a balsam poplar, but also tamarack and some other work where a larger stock has been used and it's been planted into areas where all the ash has already been killed or was harvested. And so there is the potential for those species as well, but really has to be a highlight environment where competition is being considered. So just to kind of summarize, and again, my heart always skips a beat when somebody shows their survival data, and I always look, where's swamp white oak on that list, because it seems to be doing really well in Minnesota. We've been working a lot with Wisconsin DNR as well, seems to be doing really well on some of their plantings. A picture on the lower right is kind of the initial, and then 4 years later, and some work down in western Wisconsin with DNR lands. And so the swamp white oak continues to seem like a species, both climatically, but also just ecologically, is doing well in these areas. Some of the other species on this list, like American elm, we're relying on hybrids, with disease tolerant varieties. And so many of them don't get to be much larger than 10 to 12 inches in diameter. So it's, there's still some work needs to be done with that species, but certainly shows kind of ecologically some adaptation to these sites. And then white cedar would be a great species if we could build like giant walls around it, to keep the deer away. But it seems to do well when there is kind of adequate protection. But as Noah pointed out, the microsites matter a lot. We've done some comparisons, and so planting on mounds, you get 2 times higher survival than planting in hollows. And so really thinking about different approaches, within a site and in a region, I think are really important. And most of these species on this list, as all of us appreciate, and as Noah again summarized, most commercial growers and certainly state nurseries don't have, multiple options of swamp white oak, and so, there really needs to be more, opportunities to compare different seed zones and stock types and how those play out. So I'll end with, I think, just a recognition that, ecologically, these areas are meant to be black ash forests. And so because of that, any effort to try to shift them to something else is going to face hurdles, both ecologically and operationally. And so that helps me feel better about our low survival rates of the seedlings, but these are spots that ash is adapted to. And I think it's really critical, and I'm thrilled that we're having this conversation today. And I'm thrilled to have been able to learn from Noah, and I look forward to learning from Christian as well, just to understand, how this is working, because there's no textbook or guidebook on how do you manage ash forests or something other than ash and still sustain the cultural values of ash and other species on those sites. And so both to understand what works, but also if something works well, to inform nurseries and really kind of increase our capacity to actually produce some of these species that could hold promise. And again, I showed a lot of harvested sites, but we do have some pretty good evidence that underplanting has been successful. And again, Christian will speak to that a bit, I imagine, from their work and experience also. But as long as you're dealing with some of the other key bottlenecks like competition and browse, underplanting has shown success, with some of the species that we're working with on the site. So I'll end with an acknowledgement of a lot of people who've shared their knowledge and wisdom on this, both in on the Lake States, but also certainly have learned from Les and folks like Tyler and John in Maine to understand both the importance of black ash as well as ways that we can try to deal with this grand challenge. And I'll pass it on, and Christian can maybe take it from here.
Should I just jump in, Leah?
Yes, please do. Thank you very
All
much.
right. I'm going to attempt to share my screen and see where it goes. Wrong monitor. Still the wrong monitor. Is my screen sharing at all?
Sure is.
Okay. Still on the wrong monitor. Let me tweak that. Otherwise, you're going to be looking at the side of my head the entire time. Maybe. All right, I'm just going to go with whatever we end up with. All right, how's that look? Perfect, cool. Well, I stayed awake, Tony. I actually don't
Thanks,
mind. I don't mind hearing things. My brain is like a giant spaghetti strainer. It holds a lot, but not for very long. So it's always good to keep dumping water in there, keep it full. Much like you just mentioned, oh, my screen's still on the other side and I'm looking at something else. All right. Much like you mentioned, Tony, yeah, it takes a village. Noah, you said the same thing. It's definitely not a solo effort, our work at Fond du Lac. And so these are just a few folks. I won't take the time to go over everyone, but you can see it's a long list. I will mention Shannon Kestner, as she was an instrumental part of the initial project that I'm going to be talking about. She was our wetland specialist for a number of years and has moved on to a new program, but yeah, she was a co-conspirator in some of our work here. So today I'm going to quickly talk about ash at Fond du Lac and a little bit about its importance culturally, some of the local threats, a little bit about our research project, and then I think I'm going to actually focus a little bit more time about something that's maybe a little bit unique to Fond du Lac and Indian country and maybe Minnesota, and that is how it relates to Mahnomen wild rice. And then I will talk about a little bit about our planting efforts. Leah, do I have till about 9:30 or so?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna watch the clock. So I don't know where everyone's from, but just for a little background information, Fond du Lac is in Northeast Minnesota. Fond du Lac actually translates to head of the lake, so Lake Superior. And we are just a little bit east of, or west of Duluth rather. Fond du Lac has about 46,000 acres of tribal lands now within the 100,000 acre reservation boundary, and also has interests on about 30 million acres regionally in ceded territories. And so one thing that has always been a goal with us with any sort of research that we do, and as we look to others research, is not only how can we apply this at Fond du Lac, but how can we sort of export this knowledge to other agencies and land managers. And so the resource, the black ash resource, and some of the other, and Mahnomen and some of the other things that are important to Fond du Lac are represented across the ceded territories as well. Basically, what's good for us and good for everyone else is good for us. And so it's kind of, there's a lot of mutual interest there, and it's nice to have that those partnerships and information exchange. So I'm not going to go on too long about this, but Fond du Lac has about 190 or more monoculture, essentially black ash stands, about 1,300 or more acres. So that's a little over 2 square miles. And that is just Fond du Lac's ownership. There are Fond du Lac's checkerboard ownership within our reservation, with 45% roughly of it being Fond du Lac land, and then the balance made up of private ownership, counties, and state ownership. And so collectively, I'm not exactly sure what the ash resource is across the entire reservation, but it is several square miles of forest cover type. I should mention that Minnesota itself has more black ash trees than any other state. We gained that title from Michigan the hard way, I guess. Michigan lost enough ash trees that Minnesota went from second place to first place. I'm going to talk a little bit about the unique biology of black ash within Minnesota in particular. That kind of makes it a little bit different than you might find ash especially white ash and green ash as you move out to the east. Tony mentioned a little bit, and as did Noah, but ash is unique. And although we are looking for replacement species, Tony, you've said it really well in the past. There is no cultural replacement necessarily for black ash specifically. Manchurian ash looks like a contender. But when we talk about replacement species, we're almost talking about, how do we basically keep forested wetlands forested? But ash is unique. It's reflected in the language, the Ojibwe language. Ogimak means snowshoe making tree. So the name for black ash is literally reflected in its cultural use, its dominant cultural use in the Ojibwe language. It's a ring porous species. It splits easily. And some of its other sort of unique components that make it desirable for certain end products are that it tends to be a very straight grained and bendable wood that remains strong even when bent. And you can get a lot of knot-free sort of clear wood segments out of ash that you might not get out of some other species. It's turned into a variety of products, some cultural, some not specific to Indian country, like baseball bats, for example, or guitars. I recently asked someone, what is it exactly about ash that makes it so great for cradle boards? And the cradle board is the picture in the upper right with the sort of lavender blue blanket on it. That's all ash, and you can kind of see how the wood is bent. It's all one piece, that top piece. So not only is it bendable, but for a cradle board, your goal there is to protect a baby. And so there might be other species that you could cobble some wood together or bend it, but it might be a little bit lighter, but it wouldn't be as strong. And so with that cradle board piece on the upper right, for example, you've got bent wood that still remains strong and is reasonably light. Fond du Lac's got a lot of the same threats that every forest has. Basically, climate change is a threat to ash or ash wetlands, probably more so in extreme rain and drought events, increased insects and disease pressure, especially as things warm up and we get multiple generations of different insects. Human disturbance has been a long problem. Things like railroads, roads, pipeline corridors, all sort of serve as artificial dams, creating maybe unnatural ponding on one side and a drier area on the other. It fragments wetlands, and of course, emerald ash borer. So for Minnesota, for Fond du Lac, our EAB timeline is basically that it was discovered in Superior, Wisconsin, which is just adjacent to Duluth, Minnesota, across the St. Louis River estuary in about 2013. It spread across the estuary, or it was discovered, it maybe spread earlier in about 2015. Was discovered in a residential area a short distance away in 2016. It continues to spread around Duluth, and that is very concerning for Fond du Lac because we are only about 13 miles away, as I always say, as the beetle flies, from the nearest known infestation. So it's basically a day's flight for the insect or a quick drive in a car. The St. Louis River makes up our northern boundary, which is connected to some of the infested areas. There is mostly green and black ash all along that corridor. And so the St. Louis River is essentially an insect highway as it travels seeking new ash. And it could easily and probably will follow that pathway and just continue marching westward up the St. Louis River estuary and towards Fond du Lac. So something that's unique I mentioned to Minnesota is that our black ash tends to grow in monoculture wetlands, depressional wetlands, whereas it tends to be white ash especially tends to be more of a mixed species in an upland environment. Green ash tends to be found in riparian sort of rivers and stream areas, and it's often mixed with other species. But in Minnesota, a lot of our black ash wetlands basically only have black ash, or it's 80+% of the stems per acre, or the basal area, or however you want to define it. That's not an exact number, but the black ash depressional wetlands are sort of a unique hydrology, and black ash seems to be the only species that routinely thrives and dominates these sites. And so for us to lose black ash from these sites means that we lose a lot of the ecological function that those trees perform on those sites, particularly transpiration, that continuous water pumping that all plants and trees do. And so what you can end up with, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about that, but what you can basically end up with is you take a forested depressional wetland dominated by black ash, eliminate the black ash from something like emerald ash borer, and then you end up with a non-forested condition. So that's a big ecological change, but I'm going to talk about the hydrological implications that might have at Fond du Lac. And so I have kind of the layman's analogy for a black ash depressional wetland, and it's not flawless, but I like it and I'll stick to it. I call it my bathtub guide to forest hydrology, and it's basically that black ash wetlands function a little bit like a bathtub on the landscape. It's a low spot. They hold water. They're relatively slow to drain, and they can overflow. And ash trees essentially help to keep that water table maintained. They're constantly pumping water. They're constantly removing water from the bathtub, so to speak. And they sort of keep that water in kind of an equilibrium. It's still a very wet site, but it would be much wetter if you remove those trees. So if something like EAB comes in and kills all the trees in that particular wetland, and as I'm sure most of us know, that can happen quickly within a year or a couple of years from the initial infestation. They can sweep across a pretty small site. I didn't mention it, but on a previous slide, I said that our average ash stand is about 7 acres. And so it just would not take that much time for EAB to wipe out all the ash trees within a 7-acre site. And so the water, you lose the transpiration that those ash trees go through. The bathtub fills up and that water has to go somewhere. And so it's probably going to start spilling out across the landscape in some way, shape, or form. So that's going to have implications for wild rice, which I'm going to talk to in a moment. And so when we are looking for replacement species for black ash in these types of environments, again, we're not looking necessarily for cultural replacements, but we are looking for ecological functionality replacements, hydrological functionality replacements, something to basically keep that bathtub from filling up. And so ultimately, is there a way to keep our forested ash wetlands forested? And so just like Tony and the project he mentioned on the Chippewa National Project or NOAA's project, we have undergone similar research. In fact, our research was inspired by the Chippewa National Forest Project to start looking at alternative tree species, intentionally planting them into black ash wetlands and assessing their survival, growth, health, vitality. And ultimately, we're not there yet, but we've got some preliminary work and some partnerships going to try to evaluate how these alternate species might affect the hydrology in these sites. So I deleted a bunch of slides in the interest of time, but our results basically for our project where we planted the 5 species that you can see on the slide right now. We chose species that either did well on the Chippewa National Forest Project or weren't tried on the Chippewa National Forest Project. But we also thought that even if we were duplicating species, we are far enough away, our sites were different, we weren't doing any sort of canopy manipulation at all for logistical reasons, namely that we don't think that ultimately we'll ever be able to implement enough timber sales or TSI type timber sale improvement type work, thinning projects, opening up black ash stands to firewood harvesters or what have you. And so largely we think that our black ash forests are going to go unmanaged. And when EAB comes to town, we'll kind of have to deal with the fate of that essentially. Some of those might be salvage operations, but for us to realistically get ahead of EAB and do canopy manipulation and underplanting across our sites, when they're such small sites, some of them very remote, logistically hard to operate in because they're wet. They may not freeze during the winter, or they might freeze for just a few weeks during a winter, depending on temperatures and snow cover. We really just wanted to say, hey, can we just pop trees into these ash sites without doing anything to the overstory and get any kind of survival? We had good success after our second growing season. We're actually, I think, in our 6th growing season and haven't been back recently, and I'll explain why in a moment. But we had good success with silver maple, 90+% survival. River birch, which is a species that is not native, not locally native to the Fond du Lac area. It's more of a southeastern Minnesota, southwestern Wisconsin. It's kind of its northern extent of its range. So that would be our assisted migration species. That did really well, as well as red maple, northern white cedar, which are both locally native. And then balsam poplar seedlings didn't do so well, although we did have sort of underwhelming planting stock due to a last minute nursery substitution. We are going to experiment planting balsam poplar cuttings in a partnership with NRCS this coming spring and summer. And so we're really looking forward to seeing how that plays out. But overall, we had pretty good success initially. And Tony, no need to ever apologize for low survival. I mean, if we knew the answers, it wouldn't be an experiment, right? It would just sort of be patting yourself on the back for what you already knew. So where our project failed was deer browse. And again, for logistical reasons, we chose not to initially cage this research project. We were using Plant Skid, which is a spray-on deer deterrent, and it totally failed to work. And so we ended up losing just about everything in our experiment after several years due to browse, primarily hair browse, actually, based on, you can kind of see based on how the stem gets cut. If it's a clean scissors looking cut, it's probably a hair browse. And if it's more jagged, it's probably deer browse. And so we really had a lot of hair browse mortality. And so caging is basically not something you can get away with not doing. And lesson learned, I mean, we knew the browse pressure was going to be there, but we're kind of hoping that maybe the ash wetlands would have a little less browse pressure, and the hair get in there, especially on the drier of our black ash sites. So caging for sure necessary. It roughly doubles or more the cost of planting trees by the time you get done with materials and labor. And then, as Noah mentioned in his project, you can't just walk away from cages. They need maintenance. So we have been closely monitoring the results of all those sort of regional planting efforts. This is a slightly outdated list. Tony had 8-year results, I think, up on his screen. And there's been some other projects too, but we're closely looking at it and willing to basically try any of the species that other people are having success with. And we'll continue to experiment with species that people haven't tried yet. The most unique one I heard just last week was bald cypress, which was planted around Bayfield, Wisconsin, far northern Wisconsin. I can't exactly remember what agency was trying that. They actually had good survival, except for they have a lot of winter mortality, which is not surprising, as bald cypress is a very southern species. And so climate change, unfortunately, is not linear. It's still a roller coaster ride of, on average, warmer temperatures, but we still get enough old-fashioned cold that you can't just move southern species to Minnesota and expect them not to succumb to some sort of winter damage when you get that cold snap, even if it's a shorter and less frequent cold snap than historically has been the case. So on a longer term time frame, what we're also wanting to look at it, I mentioned the long-term hydrological effects as the trees get bigger. How are they moving water compared to ash? Ash has black ash has a pretty short growing season. It's one of the last trees to leaf out in the spring and one of the first to lose its leaves in the fall. And so are there implications for species that you put into these sites that might leaf out a week, 2-3 weeks earlier and retain their leaves for a week or two longer? Could you possibly dry the site out? And then as all of these projects sort of age, seedlings inherently sort of change their physiology as they get a little older. Trees that start shade tolerant becoming increasingly less shade tolerant as they get older if they're shade intolerant species. Some species are going to recover differently than others from repeated deer browsing or hare browsing. And as the root systems grow, one of the things I'm interested about is there's been a lot of success with mounding, getting that young seedling kind of up and above the wettest parts of an ash swale. But I'm curious how that plays out as those seedlings get bigger and ultimately the entire root system is sort of down low again. Does the seedling have resilience that it gained in those first couple of years where it was given that mounding advantage? Or does it kind of neutralize essentially the mounding effect as those root systems grow down? And maybe someone on the panel today has some thoughts about that. And then, of course, weather is always going to be a factor. And as the years progress, we're going to get those drought years like we had this year. It's exceptionally wet years like we had last year, cold winters, warmer winters, etc. So I'm almost out of time, or I am out of time, and I didn't really get to the meat and potatoes of things. Leah, do I have 5 minutes?
Sure.
Okay, I wanted to tie this in. I promised to tie this into the wild rice lakes. So apologies for running slightly long, but so Mahnomen wild rice is very important to Fond du Lac. It's why the reservation exists where it does, and it is the shape that it is in, drawn on a map. There are 5 really important wild rice lakes on the Fond du Lac reservation that are managed, about 830 acres worth. And so the hydrology of all these lakes has been altered over the years with ditching systems, again, pipelines, roads, trains, and things like that. And as all of our wild rice lakes are a little bit flashier, they're subject to water table fluctuations. The water table comes up a little bit faster than it would have otherwise historically with channelized streams and ditches and things like that. They might be cut off from certain water sources or again, sort of dammed from other, depending on what side of the watershed you're on. And so wild rice is an annual species. It comes back from seed every year. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to go fast on this, but in June and early July, wild rice is very susceptible to water table fluctuations. And so that's already a big concern with climate change and sort of getting maybe an average amount of rain, but in fewer, heavier rainfall events throughout the summer. And so there's already that stress. And so our concern is that EAB will come in and alter the hydrology across those black ash wetlands. So that was 2+ square miles of black ash wetlands within Fond du Lac ownership. And I think I wish I should have that number off the top of my head, but let's just double it, 4 or 5 square miles of black ash wetlands across all the ownerships, most likely. within the head and tailwaters of our wild rice lakes. So that's a lot of surface area that might be altered due to emerald ash borer. And if you remember my bathtub analogy, that's a lot of bathtubs that might fill up and then have nowhere to go but spill across the surface and make flashy wild rice lakes even flashier, which we've seen a few events over the years where wild rice crops have essentially been wiped out by significant rain events. And the fear is that black ash destroying the hydrology and filling up those bathtubs in our black ash wetlands will exacerbate that problem. So knowing that Monoman wild rice is so important to the Fond du Lac Band and that EAB is an imminent threat, it's pretty easy for us to place our planting priorities with black ash replacement species on areas, black ash wetlands in particular, that are in the headwaters and tailwaters of our wild rice lakes, with the ultimate goal of trying to maintain the hydrology of those black ash wetlands, even if there's no longer black ash growing within them. And so we're also partnering with and working with other agencies, St. Louis County, Carleton County, Minnesota DNR, to see if to basically plant their black ash wetlands as well, where they're within the same watersheds of the wild rice lakes. And ultimately the goal being to reduce the flashiness of those lakes. So quickly, our future plans are to continue to underplant trees into the watershed areas, learn a little bit more about how watersheds function at Fond du Lac. That's something that our water and wetlands program's been working on, trying to understand sort of the complex way that water flows across the greater Fond du Lac area. Continue to monitor planting results. So we have planted not only the species that I mentioned in our research project, but have also branched out to things like swamp white oak, bur oak, hackberry, and are continuously updating sort of our list of species that we're willing to try and continue to evaluate how well they're doing. Climate change is another aspect that would change sort of our species list. And basically we're trying to throw just an awful lot of things at the wall and see what sticks. And just realize that diversity is probably our friend here. So we'll continue to work with our invasive species program to monitor EAB, work with policymakers to make sure that tribal interests are fairly represented, something that we've done regarding the local paper mill in town and their desire to sort of stockpile black ash in our backyard, essentially. Continue to partner with our neighboring entities and agencies, and support information sharing, just like this webinar and others I've been a part of and have been fortunate enough to attend as well, for sure. So if you have any questions, here's my contact info, and I would feel free to reach out to me at any time. Thanks for allowing me a couple extra minutes.
Absolutely. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. All right, so we're gonna kick it over to Dr. John Dagley and Tyler Everett for their presentation, and then we'll have a discussion section.
Thank you, Leah. I think Tyler's presentation, we're doing a co-presentation here.
Just a second, I've got that miscommunication. I will pull it up shortly, sorry. If you want to introduce yourself, John, I can pull it up.
Yeah, well, really want everyone. Thank you for organizing this event. It's nice to see some familiar faces. And again, it's a really key, I think, to keep this network of people working together and sharing information is really, really vital. Well, as Tyler brings this presentation up, I just have a few slides I wanted to share, maybe 4 slides, and then I was going to let Tyler take the rest of the slides with more of the current work. I wanted to provide just a little bit of background with some of the work that we've been doing here at the University of Maine, working with some of the tribal communities here. And I say Dina's on the call here, a lot of folks that have been part of our project for many years now. And really the genesis of our project, was hearing from some of the basket tree harvesters in Michigan talking to our basketry harvest here in Maine about EAB, and this was years ago, and there was already some communication going on in the community and concern. And that was really kind of the genesis of our project being kind of formulated in terms of thinking about developing a response plan and strategies, facing EAB. And I think our approach is a little bit different. We're definitely going to be focused more with some experimentation within the forest here in Maine, but our focus really kind of was around sustaining cultural practices with some of our early efforts. And it was bringing together, because there was just so much uncertainty about EAB, how fast it would spread, the biological dynamics of it. There was a lot of mutual learning that was taking place with our meetings when we had U.S. Forest Service folks, APHIS folks, the Maine Forest Service, tribal harvesters, and really unique and fruitful kind of communications were shared at some of our meetings. And I am continually amazed. My grandparents were basket makers, but just hearing more from the basketry harvesters, the uniqueness of a brown ash and finding a basket quality tree. And so a lot of our work early on was kind of trying to document that information in appropriate ways, but with the idea of how can we protect and preserve that information for future generations. So we had video work, we had other things that were shared back with the community in terms of locating basket quality trees and what site conditions are sought in those places. The other thing too was just developing an advocacy for a lot of the tribes here in response planning, because we had looked at where EAB was in other states and there was very little tribal involvement in terms of some of the response plans that were taking place, like in Michigan and other early states. And we wanted to change that here in Maine. So early on, memorandum of understandings were created in terms of steps that would be taken when EAB is getting close or when it's actually in our state. We worked early on in advocating for a ban of firewood from out of state coming into our state. We went down and testified, and an emergency order was created for the banning of the. Oh, Tyler, do you have the latest slide I just sent you? Sorry, this morning. It just has fewer slides, that's all. So it was, kind of focused on, in terms of sustaining the cultural practice, kind of learning what was the latest information available. And early on, we really thought the best steps we could do here from the Northeast was to try to slow that rate of spread of EAB, which was primarily being transported through firewood and other means, not just the biological flying of the insect. And so some research that we had done in other aspects kind of informed the state in terms of signage and other kind of things, in terms of getting educational materials out to people who might be interested in visiting the state of Maine. So a lot of our work here in Maine, and I'm more of a social scientist. Thankfully, I have Tyler, who's more the forester, that's adding more, and Tony and other folks. But we really kind of took a social science approach, in terms of sustaining the cultural practice as some of our first steps. And also just learning from other communities. Les Benedict, who's on the call today, a regular attendee at our meetings over the years, informing his knowledge with seed collection. His brother, Mike Benedict, was, if you can go back to that other slide there, Tyler, you can back up one, yeah. Mike Benedict in the lower right corner was one of our first attendees at one of our meetings with some of the work that he had done as part of his PhD work at the University of Minnesota in terms of the ecology and site conditions, reflective of kind of basket quality trees, was critical. And I took him out on a trip showing him some of our ash on the Penobscot River. So we've got a really core group that's been working for years together. And I hope that we can kind of continue that work because, again, if you can go to the next slide, Tyler, that would be great. This is kind of our current situation of where EAB is in our state. And we've been fortunate. We're kind of mirroring kind of Minnesota, in the sense that we're on the other end where we've been very fortunate in our ability to try, keeping EAB out of our state, but it has trickled in, came in northern Maine in 2018, and then soon after in southern Maine. And it's spreading more quickly in southern Maine than northern Maine, but there's still quite a bit, that we can do, because at this point in time, only about 10% of our ash trees are currently impacted by EAB. And if you can show the next slide. This is just a kind of a distribution, a relative density of ash in our state. And again, it's a little bit different from Minnesota in the sense that it really is 2% of our forest. It's very sporadic throughout our state, but makes up 2% of our forest, 4% of the hardwoods in our state, but it's very intermixed with other species in our forests. And fortunately, EAB is in places where it's currently not in locations where a lot of our tribal harvesters are currently collecting brown ash. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tyler to talk about some of our next steps that we're working on.
Thank you, John. Sorry for the challenges with the slide deck. I downloaded the wrong one. And my apologies to everyone for the delay there. Basul, Epchalasi, hello, good day. A lot of my work around Emerald Ash Borer has been focused on engaging tribal communities to form tribal-led science with a strong incorporation of the traditional knowledge that all the presenters, Christian, Noah, Tony, and John have all touched on so far today. And I'd like to just say real quick too that I really appreciate everyone's presentation. Some really great information has been shared. Some awesome questions have been raised in the chat. So I'll be brief with my addition just so that we can address some of those questions and then maybe do some dialogue with everybody participating on the topic of Emerald Ash Borer. A lot of my work has been focused on inventory work, and like John had talked about, the Brown Ash Task Force is this group here in the state of Maine that's worked really closely with all 5 tribal nations in Maine: the Houlton Band of Maliseet, the Aroostook Band of Micmacs, the Penobscot Nation, the Passamaquoddy at Pleasant Point, and the Passamaquoddy at Indian Township. And really kind of going through and answering questions surrounding brown ash or black ash, and questions raised by basket makers about the health of brown ash forests. And then certainly with Emerald Ash Borer, all the questions surrounding this invasive forest pest. And one of the things I saw as a knowledge gap was just where and how much ash resource was on tribal land. An inventory protocol could help there. And so I developed this as part of my master's work, which I delivered in the form of a demonstration day where I brought tribal forestry and natural resource staff to the university to do the inventory protocol and have a conversation about Emerald Ash Borer with state and federal participants there at the table to provide some input on the regulations surrounding Emerald Ash Borer. So it was a really great day where we got to work with, here on the bottom photo, we have Vice Chief of the Aroostook Band of Micmacs, Richard Silboy, and also a renowned basket maker here in the state, peeling away the outer cambium of a brown ash bolt that we cut to see if there's any evidence of Emerald Ash Borer. A training that the state entomologist, Allison Canody, had helped coordinate during the demonstration day. We had a lot of questions raised during this, and in fact, more questions than I had answers to, even after my master's work. And so those questions brought me back to school. So now I'm doing my PhD here at the university with Professor John Daigle as my advisor. And we're trying to take it to the next step. So we're identifying where ash is on tribal land, working with tribal forestry and natural resource staff to do so. But now it's how do we manage ash? How do we manage for emerald ash borer? And because this is a cultural resource, and we want to make sure that the science is tribal led, it requires a lot of input from the community. So what we'd like to produce is a tribal integrated pest management strategy, which could include aspects of silvicultural treatments, seed collection, underplanting of ash and non-ash species, the release of biological controls, and even insecticide treatments. Similar to what others had said, kind of throwing everything we have at the wall and seeing what sticks. Some of these adaptation actions have a lot of questions. And so these were raised at the demonstration day. But the concerns that were raised about them, the general confusion about them among anyone that was interested in the idea of addressing emerald ash borer, were things we would hope to kind of address in our next phase of the research. And so we want to share that background on all these different adaptation actions and garner some input and feedback from the tribal communities here in Maine on what they see as actions that could be considered in an integrated pest management strategy on tribal lands. I think this process could ensure that the science produced in this integrated pest management strategy is tribal led, and hopefully result in it actually being implemented on tribal land. We've recently started to get the ball rolling on that engagement with tribal communities here in Maine. And it kind of took on a new direction through a series of very useful one-on-one meetings with natural and cultural and forest resource staff of the 5 tribal nations here in Maine. These short one-on-one meetings helped us understand that what topics we wanted to consider in terms of these integrated pest management strategies, and then the best way to get it to our audience, the tribal community, the basket makers, the harvesters, tribal natural resource and forestry staff. And it seems like an avenue where a lot of folks are on the same page as Facebook. So we're going to produce some short video clips, just giving the brief background on some of these topics. And then looking at the comment section on these videos and seeing what we have for initial questions, things that we could share with some subject matter experts in those different areas and get some feedback on those questions that we could then share in a more formal community meeting, which would be either a Zoom session or an in-person session. And then we'd really rely on the input we get at those community meetings to develop our integrated pest management strategy, to kind of do an experiment here in the Northeast or here in Maine, similar to what Tony, Noah, and Christian have talked about with their underplanting experiments, but here in Maine, in the Northeast, with ideas generated from our tribal communities. Let's see what else I got here. Oh, these are some more pictures from the inventory demonstration day. This is myself and a couple different tribal foresters, Seneca Stevens, the Penobscot Nation. My supervisor here at USEC, Casey's snagging a picture of me behind me. A lot of people came together on that day, and we hope we can do the same with some of our future outreach efforts. I know with COVID-19 and all those issues, it's been really tough to get together in person. But as things change and progress, hopefully that's going to be a reality sooner rather than later. I think it'd be a good time now to just shift over to a discussion. John, you wanted to add anything before we close out? We can then hand it over to Leah for maybe some dialogue back and forth before the top of the hour.
No, great job, Tyler. Yeah, I think it's best now to move to some discussion.
All right, thank you everyone. That was really, really informative presentations. I know we had some questions and some answers that popped up in the chat. there was a conversation about making sure that you're protecting for browse throughout the sort of life cycle of the tree. So Christian, did you want to touch on that? I saw that you had offered a response to that question.
Yeah, probably nothing to add that I didn't have in that text, but for the benefit of the recording and such, I guess too. Yeah, the question was basically how long do you have to protect trees from browse, or how long do you have to cage them or maintain those cages? And I'll default to the default forestry answer, which is always it depends. But obviously it depends on how quickly the tree is growing. And in ash sites, they tend to be particularly challenging. And so growth is probably going to be slower than you might otherwise expect that same species to perform at on a more suited site. It's sort of optimum site. But regardless of whether it's black ash or anything that we plant that we try to protect from deer browse or hair browse or both, like Noah mentioned, you can't just walk away from these sites. So you plant the tree, you put the cage on. So sometimes you can do that right away. Sometimes you can come back in the fall. And so buy yourself a little bit of field time that way. But either way, you have to get those cages on sometime before late fall, when the deer browse and hair browse pressure on those woody things you put in the ground really ramps up. And then you have to annually revisit them, like Noah was saying, basically, because they'll get knocked down. Frost heaving actually is a factor that might take a bamboo stake and sort of heave it out of the ground. But you'll come back to that site after a winter and spring, and some of the cages will be, dumped over, tipped over, knocked over, or the seedlings themselves, especially deciduous species, really seem to kind of bend towards the light, and they'll grow out of mesh cages out of the sides. So the solid tubes have some advantage that way, in that they can't grow out the sides, but then there's other impacts, like they can harbor fungal problems, kind of forming these mini damp environments that sometimes they can be warmer environments that can benefit the tree as well. But once that tree pops out the top of that cage, you may or may not be done with it. I mentioned that hair browse was probably the most significant thing that we saw within our smaller seedlings on our research site, but deer browse was definitely a factor as well. And so as long as your tree cage is basically under 6.5 feet tall, which it's going to be, you're going to have probably a few years where that tree seedling pops out the top of that cage, but is still vulnerable to deer browse. And so then you switch into something called bud capping. I don't know if everyone's familiar with that, but you basically take a playing card piece of paper and fold it over the terminal lead on the tree, and take an ordinary household stapler and staple a piece of paper right to the top of that terminal leader on the tree that you're hoping to protect. The deer don't recognize the paper as something they want to eat, and so the paper will basically hold on for one winter season, and then usually the rain and the environment sort of makes that paper dissolve, and as the tree bud expands in the spring, will disappear. But I guess the other important point about all that is that so you've got several years of maintaining tree cages, potentially several more years of maintaining bud capping, and it compounds, because if you, like I said in my text comment, if you plant an acre today, you have to revisit that site potentially for up to 10 years. Meanwhile, the next year you're planting another acre, and the third year you're planting another acre. And so you're having to go revisit up to 10 years worth of planting. And so even if your planting ambitions are small annually, you have to realize that you're possibly babysitting 9 other years worth of planted sites, and generally all within a pretty short time frame. And so work capacity is always a problem, regardless of the agency. But I think tribes sometimes can be particularly affected because some of our programs are relatively small, and the foresters sort of wear all the hats, and our responsibilities go from traditional forestry to sort of backyard urban forestry, to tree planting, to prescribed burning, to wildfire programs. And it might just be 2, 3, 5, 6 people in a program we've got, I think, 8 for 46,000 acres, and we're doing everything. So it's a challenge to sort of get that temporary. You want 35 people sometimes, well-trained staff that you can just airdrop in for a few weeks, and then you don't have the money to pay for them otherwise. And so it just gets really challenging.
Thank you, Christian. Les, I saw you also added some comments in here about invasives. Did you want to introduce yourself and talk about your questions around that?
Bill, was that question directed to me?
Yes, sir.
I didn't quite hear it. I don't have very good speakers, so.
Oh, sorry about that. I was asking if you would want to touch on your issues with invasives and introduce yourself, because I know you've also done a lot of work with Emerald Ash Borer.
Oh, sure. My name's Les Benedict. I'm the Assistant Director for the St. Regis Mohawk Tribes Environment Office. I've also been involved with the Akwesasne Task Force on the Environment as a Black Ash Project Coordinator. And yeah, I wanted to mention, I talked a little briefly about some of the invasives. We did a couple of projects where we did some pre-mitigation work for EAB, and it was quite evident to us that we would have some problems with invasive species, particularly buckthorn. So we just wanted to make sure that we address those concerns, which is why I asked a question about, whether any of the other projects had encountered any invasives. Primarily, like I said, buckthorn is the biggest one, and it seems like we've got the mega center for buckthorn. So we worked on addressing those, and we incorporated that into our forest management plans, is to make sure that if there's any outlying populations of buckthorn, that we would treat those immediately for any areas that we cut in. Obviously, we can't address every single buckthorn that's out there, but any areas that we knew we would open up, we wanted to make sure that we first took care of any outlying populations and continued to monitor for them. Honeysuckle is another, but it doesn't seem to be that much of a problem. I think it's more spotty than buckthorn. And we have found in some of the natural stands, and it's unbelievable how far this stuff will move. We had Phragmites to deal with. I was at a remote site, and it's just on the edge of it. It's about half a mile in. Not an area you would expect to find it, but it was there. So there's always that danger, both whether you're thinning an area, or if you start losing through the EAB, you start losing material that you're going to, at least in our experience, we've encountered those invasives.
Thank you, Les. John, I saw that you responded that there's also an issue in Maine with the buckthorn.
Oh, yeah, it's a huge issue here in Maine. And really, the growth of invasives, besides just EAB, is a challenge, right? And I know, at least for the Maine Forest Service, there's, brown moth. There are other invasives too that are impacting other species. And while some of our outreach and education efforts, I think, benefits all tree species, it does create kind of competition in terms of thinking about efforts around EAB, where people kind of reprioritize and putting resources. And I think it's going to be maybe a challenge in the future. I think that we want to at least keep in mind here in Maine with people's awareness of the emerald ash borer and the importance. And I do think some of the work that we've been doing over the years has really garnered more support from landowners, private landowners, and wanting to do things like seed collection, monitoring their ash trees and so forth. And so in some ways, when we think about emerald ash borer and sustaining cultural practices, I think part of the work that we're going to need to be doing in the future is how do we kind of keep it, in people's minds, in terms of approaches or steps they can do to help stop the rate of spread of EAB. Again, with the challenge of all these other invasives, right, that are kind of coming into play and influencing people's decision making.
Thank you for sharing that. The final thing that I saw in the chat, at least, was a conversation about research to cross black ash with Manchurian ash. Tyler, did you want to touch on that?
Yeah, Tony and I both provided a resource. Jennifer Koch, her lab with the USDA, has done a lot of work on the genetics of all three ash species, and has started to shift some focus on black ash, and going right after the question that Dina had raised, which was crossing Manchurian ash with the more cold hardy black or brown ash we have here in the US, and in hopes that we might be able to find a cold hardy usable basket making material to underplant here in the Northeast or across the distribution of ash, and hopefully sustain it on the landscape. It's exciting work. Not a geneticist, so I can't speak too much on the specifics of that work, but the results, just as Dina had pointed out, would be exciting to kind of read through and see how we can take that finding or those findings and make it actionable in our practice in the forest. So, yeah.
And I guess just one follow-up on that, as all of us know, look at American chestnut or many species that there's breeding efforts. American elm we've talked about a lot today. I mean, it takes a long time for the genetics to finally be worked out. And so I think a lot of what we discussed with our presentations today was how to keep these sites forested wetlands, so you even have the option to get those species back on those sites, because once they become, to Les's earlier point, a sea of buckthorn or Phragmites or native species, it's harder to get trees back on those sites. And so part of our thinking with the planting is to just keep these as future options for more black ash once some of these slower breeding techniques and things like that are ready for prime time, and maybe that's 50 years from now, but that there's still those opportunities to restore the species to the landscape.
While we're on Manchurian ash too, Tony, like you had mentioned with swamp white oak and finding different seed sources and searching in different areas for different varieties. I think the same for Manchurian ash. If there's trouble right now with some of the ones that we've planted, I'm sure it's from a small seed source, very genetically similar. Maybe there's some varieties of Manchurian ash that are a bit more cold hardy and maybe more usable for basket making. So maybe there's not as much a need to crossbreed if we can find that there are some varieties of Manchurian ash that seem to be more amenable to some of those here in North America.
I just wanted to pipe up, I guess, excuse me, and just sort of reemphasize what Tony just said. That's a really good point. I don't think I covered it at all in my presentation, but that one of the benefits of sort of adding trees to these black ash monocultures that we have in Minnesota is, I mean, not only maintaining that hydrology for the sake of, say, wild rice lakes or things like that, but like Tony just mentioned, by keeping that water table and that site forested, it keeps reintroducing some sort of EAB resistant ash if it becomes available as an option. Because especially in Minnesota, our black ash wetlands, when you remove black ash, tend to sort of swamp out, and they basically become non-forested. And I haven't really heard about, I guess there's some research in Aiken County, a little bit south of here, where they've sort of looked at that. Again, that sort of spaghetti colander brain of mine only has a sense that I once knew this, but now I don't. But I think that what they have found is that sites that are swamped out basically are pretty slow. Tony, you can, or anyone else can correct me if you remember exactly how it went down, but are pretty slow to get black ash back into those sites. They've kind of become, they sort of flip and they become incompatible with black ash themselves, essentially. And either because the competition from other vegetation, non-forested vegetation becomes too stiff, essentially, for black ash seeds and seedlings to compete with, or the sites simply become too wet, even for black ash itself. That's kind of my recollection. I don't know if that jives with anyone else that is up to date on some of that, but so yeah, other trees can form a nice placeholder for a resistant black ash should it be developed.
Thank you. So we are 10 minutes over time now. I know that we could keep talking on and on about this really complex issue that has a lot of cultural implications. And so it's likely that we'll have future webinars and future chances to interact with one another. I want to thank our speakers for their time and sharing all of their hard work and all of their data that they've collected. It's really impressive. And I also want to just shout out to Tyler Everett, who's been working on this and is a USET staff member. So if you have further questions and want to continue the conversation, he's really your point person. And he and I work together. I'm more on the agriculture and natural resources side, but this is really his area of expertise. So Tyler, do you have any closing words before I close this out?
Yeah, I'll just follow that by saying absolutely, please don't hesitate to reach out. And that doesn't have to be just emerald ash borer, right? Anything related to forest health issues or invasive species issues. Always willing to help out, help find information sources, connect you with science with the casks, the Northeast and the Southeast casks, or just review stuff, plans, talk about some of these issues, some of the strategies you're working on. Always happy to connect with folks on those things. Emerald ash borer is definitely a focus of mine, research related in terms of my academic background right now, but outside of that, don't hesitate to reach out for sure. And I'll throw my contact information in the chat so that everybody has it. Thank you. Walali.
All right. Yawanko, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Great seeing you all. Take care.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Tyler. I think that went really well.
Yeah, I think so. I had some challenges with on my side. I must have misread John's email and then pulled up the wrong slides, but I think it worked out. He covered the information well, even without slides. So
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think it was a really good conversation. We covered a really wide breadth of different approaches and different species. And I
Mhm.
really like that it had the cultural side and also the ecological side and the outreach side and the research side. So I think it was a really well-rounded workshop.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it kind of opens the door, the work that me and Colin are doing